Today, the Supreme Court heard arguments in the case that would take Donald Trump off the 2024 ballot in the state of Colorado. The justices seem skeptical of the Colorado court's decision to remove Trump. Here's my colleague Laura Jarrett with more.
It just doesn't seem like a state call.
The justices forced to grapple with Mr. Trump's eligibility for office after 6 voters in Colorado successfully sued to get him removed from the state's primary ballot by pointing to his actions on January 6 and a provision in the 14th Amendment that disqualifies those who engaged in insurrection or rebellion from holding public office again.
The attack was incited by a sitting president of the United States to disrupt the peaceful transfer of presidential power.
All 9 justices, both conservative and liberal, appearing to bristle at the potential far-reaching consequences of Colorado's argument.
The question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States. That seems quite extraordinary, doesn't it?
Chief Justice John Roberts later raising the idea of the 14th Amendment being used as a political weapon by Democrats and Republicans alike.
It'll come down to just a handful of states that are going to decide the presidential election. That's a pretty daunting consequence.
Mr. Trump's lawyer arguing Congress, not states, must decide who is eligible for the presidency, and that the former president did not engage in insurrection.
This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection.
Let's bring in John Allen, senior national politics reporter for NBC News, Katie Benner, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for The New York Times, Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer at Slate, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor and who I am not letting leave me this hour. Mark, you know this court very well. Were you surprised by how skeptical all the judges seemed to be when it came to keeping Trump off this ballot?
I certainly wasn't surprised that the conservative justices were skeptical of the argument raised by Colorado voters challenging Trump. I was really surprised that the liberal justices, especially Ketanji Brown Jackson, jumped on the attorney arguing against Trump to say, you know, I think that you've got the history wrong. I think you've got the text wrong, and really embracing one of the most far-reaching legal theories that Trump's attorney had put forth to the court. Justice Jackson gets a lot of flack from the right for allegedly being too biased or too far to the left. But I think today she really showed she is an independent-minded jurist. And of all the justices, nobody else pushed harder to show, or at least to claim, that the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause doesn't even apply to the president. That was her belief, and she really stuck to her guns. So yeah, it was a surprising day. Going in, I thought 6-3, maybe 7-2 for Trump. Now I think 8-1 or maybe even 9-0.
Katie, how about you? Is this what you were expecting?
You know, it's interesting. Well, I'd like just to refer to the point that we just heard about Ketanji Brown Jackson. So it's true that she really did reiterate this argument that Trump's lawyer had made about whether or not the president counted under the 14th Amendment, whether or not he was an officer who could be taken off of a ballot. And I think this also speaks not just to what the justices were thinking, but to the performance, essentially, of the lawyer, Mr. Murray, who was representing the Colorado voters. You know, I would say we've all heard a lot of oral arguments. I don't know that this was the most confident oral argument I've ever heard. And it felt like there were times when all of the justices, including Gorsuch and Kagan, who he has clerked for, were almost frustrated they weren't able to get straight answers out of him, that he, in several points, declined to answer the question that had been asked, wanting instead to answer something else or to bring up a previous point or a point that he wanted to get to more. And even in that exchange with Jackson, it was hard to tell whether or not that was something she truly believed or if she felt that this was not a great argument made by the Trump lawyers. Because if you listened to the oral argument with the Trump lawyer, with Mr. Mitchell, it was clear that Amy Coney Barrett and others were saying this is a ridiculous argument. Of course, the president is an officer is an officer under the Constitution. It's almost so you could also interpret it to mean that she was just trying to get out of him a cogent argument, shoot down this thing we were just skeptical of. You just heard many of the justices, again, across the ideological spectrum, be skeptical of the argument put forth by Trump's lawyer that it doesn't count because the president isn't explicitly named, and she couldn't even get that out of him. I mean, luckily, these decisions are not made on oral arguments alone. They're made on the facts. They're made on the briefings. They're made on the research that people do. But it was a really interesting performance, I think, by the lawyer representing Colorado.
Joyce, now that this hearing is basically out of the way, how could that affect the other case that the Supreme Court could be facing just days from now, the one for absolute immunity?
So, Steph, you know, I was the appellate chief in my office before I was the United States attorney, and I will tell you that appellate lawyers are a little bit of a breed apart. They live in rarefied air, especially when you're talking about people who argue in the Supreme Court. And these cases, these lawyers really do deal in facts and law, and they don't deal in politics and the commonplace every day of life, at least not in the normal situation. But this situation is far from normal. It's certainly not lost on any of these justices that they're being drawn into a political environment that they do not want to be in, particularly with all the drama surrounding the court over the last year, all of the ethics challenges, the concern today about Justice Thomas participating in this case, despite his wife's involvement on Donald Trump's behalf following the 2020 election. So lots of reasons for the justices to minimize their involvement in these cases involving Donald Trump. They certainly do not want to be seen as deciding the outcome of the 2024 election in any way.
John, let's talk about takeaways and misinformation, because your average American was not listening to the 2 hours of audio today. But if you were, you would not have heard any debate, discussion, argument, or decision over whether or not Donald Trump incited an insurrection. Everything was about the language of the amendment, what job in government is considered an officer, past cases. But assuming, and I know I'm assuming, that the justices side with Donald Trump, isn't there the risk that the right, or at least the Trump machine, will use this to say, see, he had nothing to do with the insurrection, move on?
Yeah, absolutely, that risk exists, Stephanie, but and you're right. The justices danced around the whole, with the exception of Ketanji Brown Jackson, danced around the idea of whether this was actually an insurrection. And so, yes, if Donald Trump wins this case, I absolutely expect him to go out there and see what my lawyer said. It's a riot, not an insurrection. And so certainly I didn't participate in an insurrection. I didn't stoke an insurrection. You're going to hear that from him 100%. That does not mean that the justices need to find in favor of Colorado in this. And, you know, as some of the other guests have said, I think it would be pretty surprising at this point if they did.
Mark, it's good it was only audio, because we do not want to watch any of those justices dance. But to John's point, it's exactly what they did. They avoided the question of whether Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. Why is that?
Well, I think that's obviously the most controversial and political question embedded in this entire case. And there are so many other meaty legal issues. Does this clause cover the president? Is it self-executing? Can states enforce it, or does Congress have to step in? That the justices really wanted to focus on the drier, more technical aspects of the case. Remember, until a few days ago, it looked really likely that Donald Trump himself was going to appear at the Supreme Court and try to sit in during oral arguments, make it one of his little courtroom campaign stops. The justices are very cognizant of how all of this plays on the news and to the nation. They knew that we would be here talking about their audio, examining and scrutinizing their questions, and they didn't want the coverage to be about whether this was an insurrection. They wanted to look like 9 lawyers doing kind of dry lawyer stuff. And to that extent, I think they did succeed. And I do think that they were on generally good behavior. There wasn't the kind of grouchiness or anger that sometimes flashes through the justices in major arguments like this. You know, they all wanted to get to the bottom of the case, and they did end up finding consensus toward the end. Trump will twist that into something that it isn't. Ruling for Trump does not mean he didn't engage in an insurrection. It just means that the theories put forth by Colorado voters here didn't cut it at the court.
Joyce, there has been a lot of talk lately about the quality, the poor quality of Donald Trump's lawyers, but we did not hear that today. What did you think?
No, he was capably represented today. And something that I noticed and appreciated was that this was not a lawyer who was pandering to an audience of one. This was a lawyer who conceded arguments when he didn't have a strong position. He behaved in the way that we assume lawyers will behave when they argue in front of the Supreme Court. There's nothing remarkable about that. It's only remarkable in the context of Donald Trump, who does not respect or have any regard for the rule of law, and who seems to insist that his lawyers, by and large, stand with him and not with their obligation to the court. So in that sense, at least, this was a refreshing change of events.
Relinquish what remains of the Allspark.
So who's the insect? You? What? Who's the insect?
They were defeated on our world, and we will defeat them here.
This was just a diversion!
Security, please bring up.
Rabbit, she's already inside. Deeds! Give me an update on that reserve. What's readiness? What was his name? What was it?
Evac, sir.
Evac.
She's right in front.
We are facing a heavy, sustained attack. They appear to be after the Allspark. Stay down.